So today we're going to be talking about blood type genetics. So how do we get all the different blood types that we know are in humans? You see a picture here, we've got A positive, A minus, B positive, B minus or B negative, O. We have lots of different types of blood types. So this is just another Punnett square type problem, and I'll show you how to do it. But first, we're going to take a look at what these different blood types have in common. So in this slide, I've got pictures of like the actual red blood cells. And these are cartoon drawings, but they're showing things on the surface of those red blood cells. So I want you to take a look at the A's. These are all A blood types. They might have some other stuff like a negative or a positive or a B, but what do all the A's have in common? You'll notice that the A's all have this orange triangle, and that is something called the A antigen, okay? So the A antigen is something that they all have in common. Now we're going to take a look at the B blood types. All of them that have a B, what do they all have in common? And you'll notice they all have this blue triangle, the B antigen, in common. So they all have this blue triangle. And lastly, what do the O's have in common? And in fact, what they have in common is that they don't have these A antigens or B antigens. They don't have either of those. So when we talk about an antigen, what the heck are we talking about? We're just talking about a protein on the surface of the cell, okay? And there's not necessarily a need for you to write this down. I'm not going to test you on the definition of an antigen, but if I say the word antigen, I want you to know what it means. So you can see on the surface of this cell, there's a lot of red spikes. Those are all proteins on the surface of the cell. And these proteins kind of act as a way for other cells to detect this cell. And so it's a way for them to have something on the surface that kind of identifies that type of a cell. So the second thing I need to ask you is, what does the prefix co mean? Because we're going to be talking about a word that starts with co, and so we need to figure out what the prefix co means. I have some words here: co-parent, co-worker, coexist, co-author. You might say that co means together or with or both, and that would be true. So in these types of problems, we're going to be talking about two genes that are co-dominant. They're dominant together, or they're both dominant. So in incomplete dominance, we kind of had this. We had two dominant genes, but this is going to be different. Okay, in incomplete dominance, remember the two genes blended together. Here they're not going to blend together. Here what's happening is we're actually going to have both of the proteins showing up. So for example, on our A and our B, we have both that orange A antigen and the blue B antigen. So here's what we're going to write in our little chart. We're going to write that the dominant genes are A and B. So two genes are dominant. We've got an A gene that's dominant and a B gene that's dominant. The O gene is recessive. So we call it co-dominant because we have two dominant genes and they're going to be dominant together. They're both going to show up. They're not going to blend. They're both going to have their proteins show up on that blood type. We're going to go ahead and we're going to write down what our possibilities are. So if I have an A gene, a B gene, and an O gene, I can have a bunch of different combinations, right? Like I could have an A and an O, or a B and an O. Or I could have two O's, or I could have an A and a B. So we're going to write down what letters correspond with what types of blood. So if an individual has big A, or big A and O. And notice I write this O as little because O is recessive. We don't have any little a's here, okay? The recessive gene is the O. So if they're AA or AO, they're going to have type A blood because A is dominant. A is going to overpower that O, okay? Because A is going to make that A antigen, that protein on the surface of the blood cell. If I have BB or BO, I'm going to be type B blood. Remember, I'm writing O as a little tiny letter because that O is recessive. If I have an A and a B, I'm going to have type AB blood, which means I both have the A proteins and the B proteins on the surface of my blood cell. Remember, O doesn't code for any proteins. So if I have two O's, I don't really have anything on the surface of my blood cell, which is fine, but I'm going to have that recessive type O blood. Now, our main example here is blood type. There are a couple of other examples, like for example, in chickens, if you've got a white gene and a black gene, you'll get white and black both showing up, and it'll be like speckled. So sometimes we see some speckled phenotypes, but most of the time we're just going to be talking about blood types. So let's take a look at a sample problem now. Here's a problem. Mom is hybrid type B blood and dad is hybrid type A blood. Okay? So we always start, what is our dominant genes? What are our recessive genes? Our dominant genes are always A and B. Recessive is always O. It doesn't matter if mom doesn't have an O or dad doesn't have an O. We still write that no matter what in these problems, dominant is A and B, recessive is O. So that first step's always going to be the same for these types of problems. Our second step, we have to assign letters. Okay, so the A gene, we're going to give an A. The B gene, we're going to give a B. And O gene, we're going to give a little O. Now, I will tell you, you might see some other letters. Okay, so you might see some other people writing other letters. There's another way you can write these, and that's with an I and an A, an I and a B, and then the recessive is a little I. I think that's more confusing, so I don't use those. We're just going to use A gene is A, B gene is B, and O gene is O, and we're going to write that O really little so that we remember that it's recessive. So the next thing is we have to figure out what mom's genes are. So mom is hybrid. Remember hybrid? One of each letter. Well, remember there's no little b's, so we have to figure out what else is mom going to have. If she's got a B, she has to have a different letter. It has to be BO, and here's why. It can't be AB because otherwise it would say she has type AB blood. So it has to be BO. Dad is hybrid type A blood, so dad has two different letters, but he's got to have type A blood. So again, dad can't be AB because otherwise it would say he has type AB blood. It says he has type A blood, so dad's going to be AO. So we've got our parents. We can drop one letter into each egg, one letter in each sperm, do our Punnett square, and then we can figure out the answers. So type AB blood. In order to have AB blood, they have to have an A and a B. So that would be 1 out of 4. Type A blood. They have to have an A. They could have an O. O is recessive, so that would be 1 out of 4. Type B blood. O is recessive, so B is going to show up here, so that'd be 1 out of 4. And type O blood is 1 out of 4. So all of these are going to be 1 out of 4.